This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.
Well, hey everyone, it's Mark Bayer, and you're tuned to When Science Speaks. Thanks so much for being here. Today's episode is brought to you by Bayer Strategic Consulting in Washington, D.C., which helps scientists and engineers get funding, gain influence, and build relationships with the stakeholders who matter the most. It is such a great pleasure to welcome David Doyle to the show today. David is the author of an excellent new book, which is called Ask What You Can Do. It's a valuable resource for anyone who's thinking about entering public service, particularly local government, and especially if you're a scientist, engineer, or technologist coming from the private sector. It's available directly at askwhatyoucando.com and probably also on Amazon. David will tell us any other fine booksellers that are carrying his book. He's a passionate believer in the power of data and technology to help us understand and to solve the world's biggest challenges. David's fascinated by issues at the intersection of technology, data, and public policy, and generates new knowledge that he shares through public speaking, teaching, and of course, writing. David is currently program manager for strategic initiatives at Facebook, where he focuses on strategic work related to product quality across Facebook's apps and advertising platforms. He served as the City of Seattle's open data manager from 2016 to 2018, where he made the data generated by the City of Seattle openly available to the public. And in that role, he led the implementation of the city's open data policy, driving efforts across all city departments to release high-value data sets onto the city's open data portal. Prior to serving in city government, David held a variety of roles during his 18 years at Microsoft. He earned his Master's of Arts in Policy Studies from the University of Washington, Master of Science in Technology Management from University College Dublin, and his Bachelor of Science from Dublin Institute of Technology. Welcome to the show, David. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Mark. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to do this.
And, so in your book, Ask What You Can Do, you refer to government as the silent superhero. And what do you mean? I'm curious, what do you mean by that?
Well, first off, I should confess that I borrowed that phrase. I certainly didn't invent it, but I first came across that phrase when I read the book by Michael Lewis called The Fifth Risk. This Michael Lewis of Moneyball fame and other great books. But his most recent book was about basically the role of transitions in federal government and what happens if they're not handled well, and sort of he digs into how certain departments actually are responsible for incredible amounts of things that we never think about or that we don't realize belong to them. For instance, the weather service belonging to Department of Commerce, or agriculture overseeing parts of I think it was to do with some of the our nuclear, or not nuclear, maybe. Sorry, I'm getting mixed up. But he was going through different departments and saying, this department looks at nuclear energy. I think it was Department of Energy actually was looking at the nuclear arsenal, and agriculture had owned some things that I was really surprised by. So, but essentially, he was talking about government as this silent superhero, where lots of these things have been operating in place for decades. And lots of things were happening behind the scenes that we never heard about or never realized, things that we took for granted.
Right.
The GPS system that we all rely on so much nowadays, with our phones and our cars and things like that. Those were all government programs and are still managed by government.
Right.
And so he sort of was talking about this whole idea of government as an entity being this thing operating in the background that a society as a whole was taking for granted. And it was only when something, this sort of experience that we've had where, there wasn't a cohesive handover of power at the federal level in terms of
It's like a change in administration.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, I'm blanking on the word, the
Mhm,
transition process. So,
mhm,
and then, so I thought a lot about that. And when I was writing my book, I really said, well, that's actually really applicable to state and local government.
mhm.
So, for example, services at the local level also really only become apparent when they stop working or just are unavailable. So, for instance, during the pandemic, many of us have experienced the sort of shock of going to a park or a trail and seeing signs saying, sorry, you can't go there, or public buildings like libraries. And suddenly you realize, oh, there's all this infrastructure that we have that is being maintained and open and closed and so forth, and there are people doing all this work, but it's only when it sort of goes away that you realize, wow, like there's actually a lot of stuff here that
Right.
suddenly I can't use anymore.
Mhm.
And I think if you go to any website for a state or local government, I think you'll be amazed at the sheer scale of the services that are offered by those governments.
Right, which you might not
So
you don't realize, yeah, until
right,
until they're gone. It's funny
yeah,
because
so
I was just gonna say a corollary to that is a saying that former Senator Richard Cohen from Maine had coined, which is that government is the enemy until you need a friend.
right,
It's like you
exactly,
fall to a negative perception of government, until your house floods and you need federal flood
right.
insurance. So until your house gets blown away and you need FEMA to come and help you, and so forth. So yeah, I definitely agree with that perception. I want to ask you, many listeners of the show have scientific and technical backgrounds like you do, and are interested in career development. And in your book, you provide a really thorough and specific description of the benefits from a career growth perspective, of working in government service. And really, these benefits aren't obvious from the outside. And I'm wondering if you can share with listeners the career growth advantages that you refer to in the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of them are not immediately obvious, I would say, when you first go into public service. But for sure, one of them was the networking opportunities are really excellent, particularly if your role is public facing. In government, you typically can have a lot of freedom to go and speak or teach or to have outreach into the community. And so there's a lot of excellent opportunities to develop relations that you may not typically get within the private sector. And also, governments also, there's a tremendous network in state and local government in terms of governments in different jurisdictions speaking to each other and sharing information and ideas. So I would say after my 2 years in local government, there was hardly a state in the country where I didn't have a contact.
Right.
So that was just incredible. And then also, I mentioned exposure to the public. You also are exposed to the press at sometimes. Some of the events that governments hold have press there, and so I learned a lot about the press, local press, regional press. I was interviewed. You're sitting on panels, and so you're learning to deal with interesting and tricky questions.
Mhm,
And so I think that's also a valuable skill that sometimes we don't get much of a chance to
mhm,
develop in the tech or private sectors. And then I would say if you're a person that's interested in customer engagement or sort of like thinking about serving large populations and things
mhm,
like that. So there are some really interesting opportunities, particularly at the local government level. You're dealing with things that really matter to communities that maybe you don't also get to interact with a lot. So issues around digital equity, internet access for underserved communities, and
mhm,
things like that. And so um, that's another I think important one to call out. I
mhm,
will say also that there's another benefit that I write about in the book, and that's it's something that I sort of heard about when I was seeking career advice a few years ago, and I heard it from a couple of people, and it really made me. It was really relevant for my time in government, and that's the idea of domain versus discipline. So basically when you're changing jobs and you're thinking about maybe going from one sector to another, or you're changing from one type of job to another, the advice that I got was it's good to change one or the other but not both at the same time.
mhm,
So for example, in my case, going into local government, I was changing domain. I was going from the tech sector into the public sector, which is a huge change. But I didn't change my discipline. The type of job that I was doing in government was actually very similar to my final job at Microsoft, which was
Hmm.
I had a small team of engineers building a data platform. So I knew I could do that job uh, no matter where I did it. It was, it then gave me the time to actually, operate within that new domain of government and figure out how it works. And I could
Hmm.
tell you that for my first 6 months in there, at least my head was spinning because I just was trying to figure out, okay, this is just so different from where I've been before. It's also different from, I didn't grow up in the US. And so I was dealing with, okay, this is a new domain in terms of a place to actually work and do the work that I do, but it's also a different type of government than I grew up in. And so I was sort of learning on the double. And, a lot of technologists sort of, I think, fall into that category of, immigrants as well. So that was something that I talked about in the book a little bit, because I think it's really important that if you are going to make a leap into something like government, which I would definitely encourage lots of your listeners to think about, um, doing so when you first join, I would definitely encourage people to think about like doing the work that they're already comfortable doing,
Hmm.
getting to know the actual domain of government, and then if you want to change your role to something else later is better. So
Yeah, that is such good advice. And like you suggest, something that people don't think about, just so many variables at once. So if you can kind of solve for the variable of discipline right away, then you can focus on these other areas. And as you know, too, coming from outside of the country, having grown up outside the country, you had to adjust just even for the different system, as well as a different sector, on top of that. So adding
right.
discipline would have been too much. But really, really great advice there. And you talk about public private partnerships in the book, and they can be an important part of research projects, as we know. And you write about how your public service and your private sector experience positions you in the key role of translator between government
Mhm.
and corporate decision makers. And you mentioned the value of building empathy. And I'm wondering, can you talk more about that? I think that's a really fascinating and important aspect of this kind of transition to government from the private sector.
Yes, and I'm glad you picked up on that when in the book, because it is, as you say, one of the most important things. It's what's definitely one of the most important things I took away from my time in government. Um, yeah, in the book, I speak about empathy in a number of ways. One was, when I decided to leave Microsoft and to go work in local government, I got like some very strange reactions from people, both inside and outside of um, Microsoft where I was working. I had, obviously a lot of colleagues who were sort of scratching their heads going like, why are you doing that?
Hmm.
Some people actually asked me directly, which was interesting. And then, so there was that sort of stereotype of, why would you leave here to go into local government? But then when I got into local government, I realized that there were stereotypes about the tech sector. And
Right.
so as soon as I walked in the door, I'm like, look, all the folks there are kind of looking at me suspiciously like, and I sort of overheard things, or I heard things, like, oh, here's Mr., tech person coming in from Microsoft to tell us how to do things, right? So there was a bit of, there was like, so it was interesting. I sort of was caught in the middle between these two reactions, and it sort of got me thinking a lot about the stereotypes and how people on both sides of that equation think about each other and think about the work that they do and the skill sets and so forth. And that's where sort of the idea of the building empathy came from.
Hmm.
And then sort of I started thinking about it in terms of a virtuous cycle, sort of borrowing from that Amazon model. But thinking about, okay, so if we have more people from the tech sector or private sector going into government, maybe not working for many years, but doing 2 or 3 years like I did, sort of building up that knowledge of government, all the sort of the sheer complexity of issues that government are dealing with. I mean, it's
Hmm.
just incredible. I mean,
Right.
you've worked in government as well, and so it's really hard to explain to people who've never worked in government just how, you know, complex and layered every single decision you make is,
Hmm.
even at a low level like I was doing it. And so I think having people go into government and understand that, and then when they perhaps transition out of government and go back into the tech sector, they're taking that knowledge with them and that empathy, and then they're also thinking about the types of products and services that could be developed specifically for the government sector, because typically what happens is companies will build software for the market as a whole, and then sort of, governments around a square peg in a round hole kind of thing, until they've come back and build out those tailored solutions and things. So I think it was sort of that, building that empathy, and then, as how do you develop empathy on the other direction? And so one of the things that I tried to do with the program that I ran in local government was to get our staff out of our buildings and into the tech community. And so there was a data camp program that we had. It was sort of a training session for a few days once a year. And so I arranged for our staff working on our program, uh, open data champions and others, to go to spend a day at Tableau, which their headquarters is in Seattle, and then another company called Socrata, who have since been acquired by Tyler Technologies, but we were using their open data platform. So those two companies generously hosted our staff for one day each. And so it was this great way to get people out into different buildings, into different environments, into different domains. Like, one of the reasons I wanted people circulating in the tech sector buildings was everywhere they went, they saw data on the wall. Like, there were screens showing data. And I was sort of giving them that sense of, a lot of the decisions that are being made here are driven by data, and how can we maybe think about that from our perspective within government and the data that we're producing. So was that like, how do you create those kind of transfer of knowledge and ideas situations, that sort of serendipity. And then I think in terms of like you mentioned like public-private partnerships at the beginning of the question, and I think that can mean a number of things in government. I mean, I think it can relate to those ones that we sort of think about immediately between vendor companies, third-party companies, consultants, and the government itself, where there's shared funding and things like that. But it also refers to relationships with volunteer organizations, which is actually a huge part of how a lot of the sort of conversations around technology and data happen at local government and even at state government, because you have entities such as Code for America, brigades are in most cities, and you also have now the US Digital Response, which is an organization of volunteers that are helping with the COVID-19 response. And so I think those are sort of public-private partnerships in my mind as well, but they have a very different set of sort of criteria and almost culture than, say, a more formal public-private partnership.
Let me ask you, David, because you mentioned COVID-19. Obviously, we're all dealing with that. And in the US, there hasn't been a robust national response to the pandemic. Much of the responsibility has been placed on state and local governments. And of course, good data at that level is essential. And there's been several states where that's been controversial as far as releasing data or even modifying data to suit political ends. I'm wondering how you think this dynamic will impact the pace of technology adoption or use in local government, and also the level of interest of technologists in entering public service.
Yeah, what I meant by that, local government entering that prolonged phase, is that I think there's been a realization for some time that local government had fallen behind in terms of its technical or data capabilities in particular. And so I think some of this is highlighted by the types of investments made by entities like Bloomberg Philanthropies into developing local government capabilities, especially with data. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars here over many years. And so the value, of these programs, and I think, the fallout from some of the issues that have happened during the pandemic, I think hopefully will encourage governments to actually look at those programs and actually commit to making larger investments on, using their own resources to build up those capabilities. Obviously the budget pressures caused by that pandemic are going to make that more difficult, but I do think this is a long-term consideration that government leaders should have. And I think, other externalities are also going to play a role, not just the pandemic. I mean, I think, we're at the beginning of, the rollout of 5G, and, what are the types of capabilities that will be enabled by that. In particular, if you think about a city, we're going to be able to deploy more powerful IoT devices, Internet of Things devices, around our communities. And so they, give new capabilities. And so more data, more useful data could be collected and made available to public, to researchers, to policymakers, and also help with, you know, improving or creating new operational or service delivery opportunities. Um, so, you know, and I think also people are beginning to look at, you know, the difference between service delivery from the private sector. Like if you think about like how Amazon delivers, you know, kept up its service
Right.
during the pandemic, like, you know, and it's excellent. And other you know tech firms are doing similar things versus you know the type of service delivery that the public sector has been doing in certain areas, and people are seeing that gap and looking at that, going like, why isn't it better in the public side at times? So I think that's going to result in pressure from the public as well to say, hey, we need to actually make this better. And I think one thing I would say here is that you know, and it wasn't even clear to me, I would say, until I actually went inside government, but it's not always clear to people that outside of government that it's the provision of services that is the main focus of government. It's not about making money or a profit. It's about service. The word service
Right.
is super critical here.
Right.
So, you know, innovation is that, you know, is means something different inside of government than it does outside of government. And it's mostly around operations or service delivery.
Right.
And then when you think about disruption, it's also a different concept inside of government. It's not really about creating a new market because the government is the market in that case.
Yep.
And, you know, it's about updating processes and systems that may have been in place for a long time, you know, 10, 20 years. So when you think about that kind of technological transformation, it's really about improving those kinds of things. We're already seeing some of that beginning to happen with the implementation of more automated processes, you know, the use of bots and so forth into government workflows.
Right.
And so,
Right.
you know, so things like that. So, I also think you'll start seeing this at the leadership level in government. You'll start seeing more chief data officers and, you know, people in those types of roles. Outside of like the traditional, you know, chief technology officer, I think the need for a chief data officer within most governments now is a need. So those are the main things I would say.
Yeah, really, really, really cool. You know, just to highlight a couple of things that you said, you know, the empathy factor and the kind of bringing that strand together with the service factor that you mentioned. You know, it's government is solving the hardest problems for which there isn't a market, right? So kind of getting left with solving the thorniest issues where there's a market failure and the private market is not able to or not interested in because a profit can't be made. Of course, that's not
Mm-hmm.
the motive of the public sector, as you noted. But these are the different factors. And you talked about, you know, the government is actually dealing with this category of problem, which you could argue are some of the hardest ones. You know, when it comes to delivery, delivering in places that are not profitable from a dollars and cents perspective, but there are people who live there who need their social security checks, and they're, you know, they got to get their mail, and, you know, you got to figure out, okay, we have a universal service idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or electrifying rural areas. You know, there's, you know, companies may not be able to figure out how to make money there, which is why you need to have the government that's going to actually step in and provide those services, because the purpose of government, as we all know, is not to make money necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I want to ask you as we wrap up, you know, what types of scientific and technology training is particularly in need within local government? You talked about the chief data officers, but others perhaps too at more junior levels. And where in public service do you see exciting and meaningful career development opportunities for scientists and engineers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I would split it out to two parts. I would sort of talk about the tech and engineering side first, and then
Hmm.
maybe for scientists, because I think the tech side is clearer to people. Um, One area for sure is, you know, the need to accelerate the move of our governments into the public cloud, getting more of our infrastructure over there. Into the government public cloud, because, and you know, some of that work is on their way, but I think things like the recent pandemic and the issues that we saw at state level around, you know, unemployment insurance service issues
Hmm.
show that, you know, there's still a real need to get services into a place where we can quickly scale, and in a time of crisis. And I know that some of those issues were not directly related to a technology platform. There were other things at play, but I do feel like it was a good example of how our need to scale quickly can only be met if we're in the public cloud. I would also say in terms of tech and data and engineering, software engineering, the biggest need that I see in government right now, local government, is around data science and analytics. And I think it's the biggest opportunity to have immediate impact and have a huge return on investment. In the book, I quoted some statistics, and roughly for every $1 a government invests in analytics, the return will be about $8. And I think governments, don't perhaps think that way sometimes. They look at things as a line item cost versus actually like we need to make a long-term investment here.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's that's something I would sort of encourage government leaders to maybe think a little bit about. State and local governments are sitting on vast amounts of data, often in silos, and whose value has yet to be really unlocked. And of course, there's some legal issues around sharing of data across departments or across different government entities, but those are being overcome. I mean, there's a way around those. There are different mechanisms through which you can share data in an anonymized way. So I'd say those two things. I'd say moving to the cloud, and then analytics, data analytics for sure is a huge need. For the scientists in the audience, I would say one area for sure is we need more expertise in the public health side of things. I think that's become apparent in the pandemic. A lot of people think a lot of this work is done at a federal level, which it is, but there are also many programs and opportunities at the state level in particular, and also at municipal level. Similarly, there are many opportunities for scientists at, for thinking about the environment and climate change, ecology, fish and wildlife, agriculture. There's some really interesting challenges there in terms of climate change and research and our response to those things. So I think, and then, having more scientists there helps obviously advise government leaders and policymakers. And I think this is something that scientists in particular can play a real role in. And, each state or region will have different needs and opportunities. And, Washington has very specific needs. Mm-hmm. But I would definitely encourage your listeners, if they're interested, especially if they're in the science side of things, to go to your local government websites or your state government website and look at, just basically do some research there and look at all the different programs that are being offered, the types of jobs that they're hiring for. And that will give you a sense of the scale of some of these programs and what's going on. And also, just the partnerships that exist between, say, universities and governments and, those third-party entities. So whether you work directly in government or a sort of in between government and a research entity or something like that. So there are many ways in which you can contribute. And I would also say to scientists and engineers that often if you are a lecturer or an adjunct professor at a public university, that's basically serving in government as well. It's often overlooked, education, public education. Mm-hmm. In my state, in Washington State, the public universities are managed by the state. So you're a state employee if you are, a faculty member there. So that's actually another way of completing public service, is to actually teach. And so that's sometimes overlooked. So I would say those are the main ways that scientists and engineers could think about doing a tour of duty in government.
Great. Really specific and helpful information, David. The book is Ask What You Can Do. It's available at askwhatyoucando.com. Are there other places, David, that people can look for the book?
It's basically on sale through Amazon. So if they go to my website that you've just called out, they'll be able to find it there.
Great. Thank you again for bringing your really interesting perspectives to this question and helping scientists and engineers, technologists, envision what it might be like to work in government and how to get involved. Just really very helpful. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And listeners, thanks for being here on this episode of When Science Speaks. And I hope you'll be back next time on the next episode of When Science Speaks.
This is When Science Speaks, a new web series profiling innovative and interesting people working in science and technical fields, from academia to industry to the nonprofit world. We explore how to be a powerhouse advocate for science and your research, how to advance your career in meaningful ways that make you happy, and how to push back on the ongoing assault on science and other related issues of interest happening in the world.